The German shepherd walked into the courtroom and ignored the woman who had loved him more than anyone in the world. For one long second, no one understood what they were watching. Not the judge sitting above the packed room. Not the attorneys frozen beside their tables. Not the federal agents standing along the walls with their arms crossed and their faces hard. Not even Rachel Carter herself. Because after 9 years together, after hundreds of dangerous searches, after nights spent in motel rooms, command posts, parking lots, and rain-soaked fields, Titan should have gone straight to her. He should have pulled toward the defense table, pressed his head into her lap, and let the whole courtroom see what loyalty looked like. Instead, he stopped in the middle of the aisle and stared at someone else. The old federal courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. Morning light came through the tall windows in narrow bars of gold, touching the polished floors and the rows of benches filled with reporters, former agents, and curious strangers. Outside, television crews waited behind barricades. Inside, every seat had been taken before the hearing began. They had all come to witness what most people believed would be the final legal chapter of former FBI Special Agent Rachel Carter. At 41, Rachel looked older than the photographs the news still used whenever her case returned to the headlines. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back neatly. Her face was pale from years spent behind concrete walls and fluorescent lights. But her blue eyes remained steady. Exhausted, yes. Wounded, certainly. Defeated, never. She sat at the defense table in modest court-approved clothes, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white. For years, she had said the same thing to anyone who would listen. She was innocent. For years, fewer and fewer people had listened. Today was supposed to be procedural. One last hearing before her conviction became permanent. One more court date where old arguments were repeated, old wounds were reopened, and nothing changed. Rachel had stopped expecting miracles. She had only made one personal request. She wanted to see Titan one last time. When the courtroom doors opened and 2 federal K-9 handlers entered with the German shepherd between them, whispers moved through the gallery. Titan was 9 now. His sable coat carried silver around the muzzle. His body was heavier than it had been in his prime, but his amber eyes still held the same sharp intelligence Rachel remembered from 1,000 operations. The sight of him cracked her composure for the first time that morning. Her lips trembled. "Hey, partner," she whispered. Titan heard her. His ears twitched at the sound of her voice. Every person watching understood what was supposed to happen next. The dog would run to Rachel. The room would soften. Cameras would capture one last reunion between a disgraced agent and the K-9 who had once made her famous. But Titan did not go to her. He stood still. Slowly his head turned. His gaze moved past Rachel, past the attorneys, past the marshals, past the spectators. Then his eyes locked onto a man seated near the prosecution team. Victor Langston, 58 years old, senior federal advisor. Impeccable gray suit. Careful smile. Decades of influence wrapped in the polished confidence of a man who had never been forced to explain himself to people beneath him. Titan stared at him without blinking. One of the handlers gave the leash a gentle tug. "Come on, Titan." The dog refused. Rachel frowned. A cold feeling opened inside her chest. She knew that posture. She had seen it in warehouses before raids, in airports during searches, in dark rooms where danger had not yet revealed its name. Titan was not confused. Titan was not distracted. Titan had found something. He took one slow step toward Victor. Then another. Victor shifted in his chair. The movement was small, but Rachel saw it. His smile remained in place, yet it no longer reached his eyes. Titan stopped 10 feet away from him. His body stiffened. His ears rose. Every muscle went still. Then, from deep within his chest, the German shepherd released a low sound. Not a bark. Not a growl. A warning. And in that instant, every person in the courtroom turned toward Victor Langston. 24 hours earlier. Long before Titan stepped into that courtroom, Rachel Carter sat alone inside a small concrete cell at the Federal Detention Center outside Richmond. The room was barely 8 feet by 10. A narrow bunk pressed against one wall. A steel sink reflected the flat glow of a fluorescent light. Beyond a reinforced window, rain drifted across a gray Virginia sky. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, old paper, and everything Rachel had learned to endure. She sat on the edge of the bunk with her hands folded in her lap, trying not to count the hours until morning. The guard outside her door paused. "Legal services in 20 minutes, Carter." Rachel nodded. "Thank you." The footsteps moved on. Silence returned. She looked toward the window, but she was not really seeing the rain. She was thinking of Titan. 9 years earlier, he had arrived in her life as a young K-9 trainee with oversized paws, too much energy, and a habit of stealing socks from the laundry baskets at Quantico. Rachel had been told he was smart, stubborn, and difficult to impress. Within a week, she knew all three were true. Together, they had worked airports, warehouses, ports, forests, office towers, and abandoned buildings. They had spent birthdays on assignments and holidays in federal safe houses. They had ridden thousands of miles of highway together, Titan sleeping with his head against the back seat, while Rachel drove through the night, with coffee going cold in the cup holder. He became more than a working dog. He became family. Rachel reached beneath her pillow and pulled out a worn photograph. The edges were soft from years of handling. In it, a younger Rachel stood beside Titan on a sunny training field at Quantico. The dog sat proudly, ears high, chest out, as if he knew the camera existed entirely for him. She remembered that day perfectly. Titan had completed one of the hardest certification exercises in record time, then celebrated by stealing half of her turkey sandwich from a picnic table. The memory made her smile despite herself. A quiet knock came at the door. Attorney Michael Reeves entered carrying a thin folder and the tired expression of a man who had spent years pushing against walls that refused to move. He was in his mid-50s, kind-eyed, careful with his words, and one of the few people who had not walked away when Rachel's name became inconvenient. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Rachel set the photograph on her knee. "I have had better weeks." Michael sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Finally, Rachel asked, "Did they approve it?" Michael looked down at the folder. His hesitation lasted less than a second, but she felt it. Then he nodded. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Before the hearing, Titan will be brought to the courthouse." Rachel closed her eyes. Relief crossed her face so sharply it almost looked like pain. "Thank you," she whispered. Michael lowered his gaze. "I wish I could do more." She opened her eyes and offered the faintest smile. "You did not give up. That matters." After he left, Rachel remained awake long after lights out. Somewhere down the corridor, a television murmured. Doors opened and closed. The detention center continued its ordinary routine, indifferent to the fact that her whole heart was waiting for morning. For the first time in months, she had something to look forward to. One last chance to see the partner who had never judged her by headlines. Nearly 30 miles away, inside a federal K-9 facility near Quantico, Titan lay awake in his kennel. The old German shepherd had changed with age. Gray touched his muzzle. His hips were stiffer when he stood after long rest, but his eyes remained clear and alert. When senior handler Mark Benson approached with paperwork in one hand and a leash in the other, Titan immediately lifted his head. "Big day tomorrow, buddy," Mark said. Titan stood. Mark smiled sadly as he opened the kennel gate. "You get to see her." At the word her, Titan's ears rose. His tail moved once, then again. He stepped forward and looked down the corridor as if the distance between him and Rachel had suddenly become something he could cross. Mark clipped on the leash, watching the old dog carefully. "Yeah," he murmured. "I thought you would understand. Before the headlines, before the conviction, before strangers said." Her name like a warning. Rachel Carter had been the kind of agent people trusted without hesitation. 10 years earlier, the FBI field office in Norfolk moved with the steady rhythm of phones, keyboards, printers, and coffee machines. Rain tapped against windows overlooking the harbor. Agents rushed between desks carrying files and half-finished conversations. Rachel moved through it all without drama. At 31, she had already earned a reputation for patience and precision. She was not the loudest person in a command room. She did not perform confidence for attention. She simply noticed what other people missed, asked the question no one wanted to ask, and stayed with the facts until they pointed somewhere real. Titan was barely a year old when they were paired. His paws looked too big for his body. His ears seemed to have been borrowed from a larger dog. He had endless energy and almost no interest in impressing anyone. Trainers called him difficult. Rachel called him honest. Their partnership began during a regional training exercise outside Quantico. Dozens of dogs and handlers worked through drills under cold morning light. Most teams performed well. Rachel and Titan moved differently. There was no showmanship in it. No dramatic commands. Just a rhythm that developed almost immediately. During one exercise, Titan located a hidden object nearly 20 minutes faster than expected. During another, he alerted on a clue every other team had missed. By the end of the week, instructors were already talking about them as one of the strongest new teams in the program. Years passed. Assignments came and went. The bond deepened quietly. They worked long days and longer nights. They sat in surveillance vans while rain turned windshield glass into silver streaks. They crossed state lines with case files stacked in the back seat. Rachel used to joke that Titan spent more time with her than any human being alive. Titan never seemed to mind. One autumn evening, after a successful operation in North Carolina, Rachel sat beside a small lake near a temporary field office. The setting sun painted the water gold. Titan rested beside her, tired from the long day, but still refusing to let go of his ball. Agent David Mercer walked over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "You know what your problem is?" he asked. Rachel accepted 1 cup. "Only one." David nodded toward Titan. "You trust him more than people." Rachel looked down. Titan stared back at her with complete confidence, ball hanging crookedly from his mouth. She smiled. "Can you blame me?" David laughed. Back then, the answer had been simple. No, nobody could blame her. Titan had never lied, never flattered, never hidden motives behind polite language. He did not care about rank, reputation, politics, or career survival. He only understood work, loyalty, and the person beside him. Years later, Rachel would remember that conversation more clearly than almost anything else. Because people failed her, Titan never did. The case that destroyed Rachel Carter began on a cold November morning in Washington, D.C. Rain fell in thin gray sheets over the city. Traffic crawled beneath an overcast sky. At FBI headquarters, agents hurried through security checkpoints with files under their arms and coffee in their hands. To anyone else, it looked ordinary. Rachel would spend years wishing it had been. At the time, she was leading a sensitive investigation involving financial corruption, missing federal assets, and a network of private contractors connected to powerful government consulting firms. The case had already consumed 18 months of her life. It was complicated, politically uncomfortable, and full of people who preferred shadows to sunlight. Titan had been beside her through most of it. He accompanied her during searches, evidence reviews, and interviews. More than once, his instincts drew attention to something human eyes had skipped. A folder placed in the wrong box. A storage room that had supposedly been cleared. A briefcase carried by the same man into too many important meetings. The deeper the investigation went, the stranger things became. Records disappeared. Witnesses changed statements. Reports were revised without explanation. Important documents seemed to vanish just before scheduled review. Rachel kept pushing forward because she believed what she had always believed. The truth did not need permission to exist. It only needed someone stubborn enough to follow it. One evening, after a 12-hour day, she sat alone in a temporary field office studying a wall covered with photographs, timelines, bank records, and red string. Titan slept beneath the table, his breathing slow and steady. The room smelled of coffee, printer ink, and damp jackets. David Mercer entered carrying a folder. His face told her something was wrong before he spoke. "You need to see this," he said. Rachel opened the folder and frowned. Several documents had been altered. Dates no longer matched earlier copies. Approval signatures appeared where none had existed. Entire sections had changed. "That is impossible," she whispered. David's expression remained grim. "That is what I said." The discovery triggered internal reviews. Then meetings. Then more questions. Then everything turned. Within weeks, attention shifted away from the investigation and onto Rachel herself. Allegations appeared with unnatural speed. Accusations spread. Decisions she had made years earlier were pulled apart and reframed. Actions once considered routine became suspicious when described by people who wanted them to sound that way. Rachel remembered the day federal investigators came to question her. The hallway outside her office felt too quiet. Conversations stopped when she passed. Some colleagues still believed her, but became afraid to say so in public. Others stepped away as if loyalty were contagious. Titan noticed before Rachel admitted it to herself. He grew alert whenever certain officials entered meetings. His eyes followed them carefully. More than once, she found him staring toward Victor Langston, a senior advisor attached to Oversight Review. At the time, she dismissed it. Victor was respected, influential, trusted by nearly everyone. He spoke in calm sentences and wore authority like a tailored suit. There was no obvious reason to suspect him, so Rachel ignored the dog. Months passed. Reviews became hearings. Hearings became formal charges. News outlets seized the story. Public opinion hardened long before a verdict was reached. Every headline seemed to ask whether Rachel Carter had betrayed the badge, even though the public had only been shown pieces of the truth. Through it all, she repeated the same words. I did not do what they say I did. Few people listened. Eventually, the verdict came. Rachel remembered the courtroom, the polished wood, the hum of air conditioning, the sickening silence after the decision. She remembered looking toward familiar faces and seeing doubt where friendship had once lived. Most of all, she remembered who was not there. Titan had been removed from active service before the final proceedings. Regulations, procedures, policies. He became a line item in a federal file instead of the partner who had stood beside her through everything. And yet, even separated from him, Rachel never stopped feeling that one truth remained unchanged. Titan knew her. Titan remembered. While the world argued about Rachel Carter, Titan continued doing what he had always done. He waited. The federal K-9 facility near Quantico sat beyond training fields, wooded trails, and chain-link fences that shone with dew in the mornings. Seasons moved across the property. Summers faded into autumn. Winter hardened the ground. Spring returned with green grass and wet leaves. Through it all, Titan remained. Every morning, he followed the routine. Training, exercise, medical checks, obedience drills, retirement evaluations. He obeyed commands with professional discipline. He accepted new handlers politely. He worked when asked. But every afternoon, around 4 o'clock, he walked to the main entrance and sat facing the gate. At first, the handlers thought it was coincidence. Then weeks passed. Then months. The behavior never changed. He still thinks she is coming back, one handler said one evening. Another answered quietly, dogs do not understand court rulings. Maybe not. But Titan understood absence. He understood that Rachel's scent no longer came through the door. He understood that her voice no longer called him from the parking lot. He understood that something unfinished had been left between them, and no official memo could explain it away. On quiet nights, after the facility emptied, Titan carried an old training ball into the corner of his kennel. The ball had belonged to Rachel. Years earlier, she had used it as his reward after successful searches. Most dogs eventually forgot old objects. Titan did not. Senior handler Mark Benson often found him resting with his head beside it. Mark had worked with K-9 units for nearly 2 decades. He had seen loyalty before. He had seen handlers mourn dogs and dogs grieve handlers. But Titan's waiting felt different. It was not restless or frantic. It was steady, patient, as though the dog had decided the story was not over simply because humans had closed the file. One rainy night, Mark stopped outside the kennel during his final inspection round. Titan was awake, watching the corridor. You are stubborn, buddy, Mark said. Titan's ears twitched. Mark crouched beside the gate. You know, I have worked with a lot of dogs. None of them waited like this. Titan stepped closer. Mark lowered his voice. She never stopped asking about you either. The dog's tail moved once against the concrete floor. Over the years, several families offered to adopt Titan after his retirement. Experienced handlers volunteered. Former military personnel asked. Every option looked good on paper. But Titan stayed cooperative and distant with everyone. Respectful, but never fully present. Part of him remained with Rachel. Nearly 3 years after her conviction, a package arrived at the facility. Inside was a simple birthday card, approved through official channels. No photograph. No decorations. Just Rachel's handwriting. Mark stood outside Titan's kennel and read it aloud. Happy birthday, partner. I hope they are giving you too many treats and not enough rules. Be good. I miss you every day. When Mark finished, Titan gently took the card in his mouth, carried it to the back of his kennel, and placed it beside Rachel's old ball. Then he lay down next to both. Mark stood there a long time without saying a word. After that, another card came. Then another. Every birthday. Every year. Rachel never forgot. Neither did Titan. The morning of the hearing arrived beneath a sky the color of steel. Low clouds hung over Richmond while cold wind pushed fallen. leaves along the sidewalks. At the K9 facility, lights came on before dawn. Most of the building remained quiet, but Titan was already awake. He stood at the kennel gate, ears lifted, eyes fixed on the hallway. Mark Benson appeared with a leash and transport paperwork. Titan stepped forward immediately. "Easy," Mark said softly, though he knew the dog needed no calming. "Today is the day." The leash clipped onto Titan's collar. Together they walked past training rooms, equipment lockers, and bulletin boards filled with schedules. The smell of disinfectant mixed with coffee drifting from the break room. Outside, a dark government SUV waited with rain still clinging to its windows. Titan climbed into the rear compartment and settled onto the padded platform. During most drives, he slept. Not this time. For nearly an hour, he sat upright, watching the wet highway through the glass as windshield wipers swept back and forth. Mark sat beside him, glancing over now and then at the old dog's alert posture. "You know where we are going, do you not?" he murmured. Titan did not turn away from the window. Inside the detention center, Rachel stood before a small mirror fastening the collar of her white shirt. The court-approved clothing felt strange after years of uniforms. Her reflection looked unfamiliar. Older, tired, but beneath the exhaustion, she still recognized herself. A guard appeared. "It is time." Rachel nodded. During the drive to the courthouse, rain began again. Small drops raced across the vehicle window while Richmond blurred past in shades of gray and brick. Rachel stared outside, hands folded in her lap. Somewhere nearby, Titan was making the same journey. The thought steadied her. The courthouse stood in downtown Richmond, surrounded by cameras, barricades, and federal officers. Reporters spoke into microphones. Court staff moved quickly through polished halls. Spectators filled the gallery long before the proceeding began. Everyone expected another routine hearing. Nobody expected the past to walk in on four paws. Titan entered through a secure service corridor. Mark guided him toward a waiting room near the courtroom. The German shepherd moved calmly, but with unusual focus. Staff members smiled as he passed. One clerk whispered, "Beautiful dog." Titan barely noticed. Mark knelt and adjusted the leash. "You are going to see her in a few minutes." Titan's ears rose instantly. A court officer opened the door. "Bring him in." Titan stood. His body became still, focused, ready. Then he stepped forward into the room where every secret Rachel had been unable to prove was waiting. The courtroom doors opened slowly, and every conversation stopped. Titan entered first. His claws clicked against the polished wooden floor, each sound clear in the sudden quiet. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. Reporters, attorneys, court personnel, federal agents, spectators who had come expecting paperwork and procedure. For one breath, no one looked at Rachel Carter's legal file. They looked at the dog. Rachel sat at the defense table. The moment she saw him, her breath caught. 9 years rushed back all at once. Early training mornings, long highway drives, cold raids, quiet motel rooms. The warmth of his head against her hand after terrible days. Titan looked older. His muzzle had turned silver. His gait was slower. But to Rachel, he was still her partner. "Titan," she whispered. The dog heard his name. His ears twitched. He paused. Everyone expected the reunion. It did not come. Titan's head turned slowly across the room. His gaze passed over Rachel. It passed over the defense table and the prosecution team. It passed the gallery and stopped on Victor Langston. Victor sat several rows away, calm and carefully dressed, with the relaxed posture of a man who had attended too many hearings to fear them. But when Titan locked eyes with him, tension appeared in his shoulders. Rachel saw it. Mark Benson saw it. Titan moved forward. "Titan," Mark said, touching the leash. The dog ignored him. One step, then another. A ripple of confusion spread through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward. The prosecutor beside Victor lowered her pen. Rachel felt her pulse quicken because she knew this behavior. Titan only became this focused when something in a room demanded his complete attention. He stopped 10 feet from Victor. His ears stood upright. His body went rigid. Victor adjusted his tie and gave a faint laugh. "Perhaps he remembers me." No one laughed with him. Titan lowered his nose. He inhaled once, then again, as if confirming a memory carried for years. Then he made that low sound. Rachel stared at Victor. Victor looked away. And for the first time in years, Rachel felt a question rise inside her that she had never allowed herself to ask. What if Titan knew something she had missed? The warning sound faded, but the tension remained. No one wanted to move. Even the judge seemed uncertain whether interrupting the dog would be an interruption of the proceeding or the first honest thing the room had seen all morning. Victor forced a polite smile toward the bench. Your Honor, perhaps the dog is confused by the crowd. The words sounded reasonable. They also sounded rehearsed. Mark Benson frowned. He had known Titan for years. Confused was not a word anyone used for him. The handler stepped forward. Titan. This time the dog moved, but not toward Mark and not toward Rachel. He lowered his nose and began examining the space around Victor's chair. The armrest. The floor. The side of a leather briefcase resting near Victor's feet. Rachel felt the room tilt slightly. She had seen that briefcase before. A memory surfaced. A conference room years earlier. Rain against the windows. Senior officials gathered around a long table. Victor entering late with that same brown leather briefcase in his left hand. Titan, beneath Rachel's chair, suddenly lifting his head and staring. She had noticed. Victor had laughed it off. She had forgotten. Until now. Titan paused near the briefcase. He looked up at Victor with the same intense focus Rachel remembered from searches. Not aggression. Recognition. Rachel stood. Several heads turned toward her. Your Honor, she said carefully. The judge looked at her. Ms. Carter. Rachel kept her eyes on Titan. That dog is not reacting randomly. Victor's expression tightened. The judge folded his hands. Explain. Rachel swallowed. Titan was trained to associate patterns. People. Objects. Places. Scent. Behavior. He remembers details most people forget. She looked toward Victor. During the final months of my investigation, he reacted to Mr. Langston more than once. I dismissed it then. I do not think I should have. Victor rose halfway from his seat. This is absurd. We are talking about an animal, not evidence. His tone was sharp enough to make the room notice. Then, from the gallery, a reporter raised one hand. The judge gave him a warning look. This is not a press conference. I understand, Your Honor, the reporter said. But I covered Agent Carter's case from the beginning. There was a photograph from one of the internal briefings. It was published years ago. The dog was staring at Mr. Langston in that picture too. A murmur passed through the room. Victor's color faded slightly. Rachel felt another piece of memory fall into place. The briefing photo. Titan under the table. Victor near the screen. Everyone had treated it like a meaningless background detail. Maybe it had not been meaningless. Titan suddenly turned away from Victor's chair and walked toward the prosecution table. Mark followed carefully, giving him enough slack. The dog lowered his nose near several archived evidence boxes stacked beside the table. He passed 2 containers without interest. At the third, he stopped. The label was old, but still readable. Carter Administrative Review. Supplemental Materials. Rachel recognized the case number immediately. Her breath caught. That container belonged to one of the final evidence reviews before her conviction. Officially, it had held nothing important. Officially, every relevant item had been logged, reviewed, and disclosed. Titan sat beside it. Then he placed one paw against the side of the box and looked at Rachel. Not at Mark. Not at the judge. At Rachel. The courtroom became still. Open it, Rachel whispered. Victor objected immediately. Your Honor, this is highly irregular and completely outside the scope of today's hearing. Michael Reeves, Rachel's attorney, stood quickly. Your Honor, if that container is part of the archived record, the defense has a right to know what is inside it. The judge studied the room. His eyes moved from Rachel to Victor, then to Titan sitting unmoving beside the box. Finally, he spoke. Open it. Court staff brought the container forward. Dust coated the lid. The seal showed age but remained intact. A technician checked the inventory sheet, then cut the seal under the judge's direction. Inside were folders, archived reports, and several digital drives sealed in evidence sleeves. The technician counted them, then frowned. Your Honor. The judge leaned forward. What is it? The technician checked the sheet again. The archive list says there should be 3 drives. He looked into the box. There are 4. No one spoke. Rachel felt her heart begin to pound. Victor lowered his gaze. Beside the evidence box, Titan watched the extra drive as though he had spent years waiting for humans to find it. What had begun as a final goodbye became the reopening of a buried case. The judge ordered an immediate recess while the unexpected drive was reviewed. Nobody wanted to leave. Reporters remained in their seats. Federal agents whispered near the walls. The prosecution team stood in tense clusters. Michael Reeves leaned over the defense table, speaking softly to Rachel, but she barely heard him. Her eyes stayed on Titan. The German shepherd lay beside the evidence container, calm and alert, his work not finished. Mark Benson crouched beside him. "What did you remember, old friend?" 20 minutes later, the courtroom technician connected the extra drive to a secure review system. A large monitor near the bench flickered to life. Rows of files appeared. Audio recordings, financial spreadsheets, internal communications, administrative summaries, archived reports, material that had never appeared in Rachel's trial. Michael Reeves stood slowly. "Your Honor, these files were never disclosed to the defense." The lead prosecutor looked stunned. "I have never seen them either." The judge ordered silence, but the room had already changed. You could feel it in the way people leaned forward. The past was no longer a settled record. It was evidence waiting to speak. The technician opened the first folder. Timestamps from nearly a decade earlier filled the screen. Each file originated during the final months of Rachel's investigation, the same period when records began disappearing and suspicion turned toward her. One file contained correspondence between officials discussing concerns raised by Rachel's team. The concerns matched exactly what she had tried to investigate before the case against her began. Another file contained requests for additional review that had never reached the Oversight Committee. Another contained evidence summaries that differed sharply from the versions introduced in court. Rachel sat motionless. For years, she had insisted important information had vanished. Now the vanished information was glowing on a courtroom screen. The technician opened a folder labeled Administrative Review. Inside were several recorded meetings. One video thumbnail caught Rachel's attention immediately. She knew the conference room. She knew the date. It had been one of the final internal briefings before her investigation collapsed. The video began. Grainy footage filled the monitor. Officials sat around a long table. Rachel appeared near the screen presenting findings. Several people asked questions. Then Victor Langston entered the room carrying his familiar leather briefcase. At that exact moment, Titan, visible beneath the table, lifted his head and focused entirely on Victor. The courtroom fell silent. Rachel's skin prickled. The memory she had been chasing all morning now stood in front of her. Titan had noticed him. Years ago. The footage continued. The meeting turned to evidence reviews and pending approvals. A field agent asked why certain investigative requests had been delayed. Victor answered before anyone else could. At the time, his explanation sounded routine. Now, compared against the newly discovered files, it did not match. Michael Reeves leaned toward the screen. His voice remained calm, but emotion trembled under it. "Your Honor, this appears to be the beginning of a very different story than the one this court was told." Titan lowered himself onto the floor. For the first time since entering the courtroom, he turned toward Rachel. This time, he did not look away. The courtroom remained suspended between disbelief and revelation. Rain slid down the windows while they recovered. Files transformed a hearing everyone had considered routine into something no one could ignore. Michael Reeves moved through the records carefully, file by file, timestamp by timestamp. Every document raised questions. Every question pointed toward omissions that should never have existed. Rachel sat beside Titan, afraid to hope too much. Hope had hurt her before. It had risen during appeals, during reviews, during letters from people who promised they had found something important. It had collapsed every time. But this felt different. The evidence was not a rumor. It was not a memory. It was there, in front of everyone. Internal communications appeared on the screen. Several messages referenced delays, revisions, redirected review channels, and unexplained changes to investigative findings. None of them alone proved the whole conspiracy Rachel had suspected. But together, they formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss. The judge removed his glasses and studied the screen. "Were these communications available during the original proceedings?" he asked. The lead prosecutor looked uncomfortable. "No, Your Honor. Not to my knowledge." Michael rose. "They were not provided to the defense." Rachel looked down at her hands. Hearing it said in court felt unreal. For years, she had been treated like a woman inventing shadows because she could not accept guilt. Now the shadows had names, dates, and file paths. Another video opened. This one showed an internal review session held shortly before Rachel's arrest. Several participants discussed missing records connected to the corruption investigation. The footage stopped abruptly before the questions were answered. The technician frowned. There is a companion file. He opened it. This version continued several minutes longer. The courtroom watched in complete silence as the missing portion played. Agents requested clarification. A supervisor asked why certain evidence had been removed from the main review channel. Another person asked why Rachel's follow-up requests had been frozen. Victor's voice came through the speakers. Calm, controlled, administrative. But his explanation contradicted the written records that had just been recovered. Michael looked toward the bench. Your Honor, portions of the original record appear to have been omitted. The statement seemed to settle into the wood and walls. Victor finally rose. There are reasonable explanations for administrative decisions made years ago, he said. Rachel studied him. His voice still carried authority, but the certainty was gone. For the first time, she saw what Titan might have sensed long before she did. Concern. The judge raised one hand. Those explanations can be addressed later. Right now, this court is looking at material that should have been disclosed from the beginning. Titan lifted his head and looked toward Victor one final time. Then he relaxed completely, as if the burden he had carried for years had finally passed to the people responsible for carrying it. By late afternoon, the hearing no longer resembled the proceeding that had begun that morning. The rain had stopped. Pale sunlight now crossed the courtroom floor. No one seemed to notice the weather change. Additional specialists had been brought in. Federal archivists reviewed file histories. Technical analysts verified timestamps. Legal staff compared the recovered materials against the original trial record. The conclusions arrived slowly, then all at once. Authentic, consistent, previously undisclosed. Michael Reeves stood beside Rachel's table with an updated report in his hands. His fingers trembled. For years, he had fought with fragments, suspicion, and unanswered questions. Now, at last, he held proof. Rachel sat quietly with Titan at her feet. Every so often, she reached down and brushed her fingers through the silver fur around his neck. The simple motion kept her anchored. She needed the feel of him there to believe this was real. The judge called the courtroom back to order. Whispers died instantly. This court has reviewed substantial new information that was not available during the original proceedings, he said. Rachel's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear. The judge continued. The newly recovered materials raised significant questions regarding the completeness and reliability of evidence previously presented. Michael lowered his head for a moment. Across the room, Victor stared toward the floor. His authority no longer filled the room. The documents did. The judge listed several findings. Missing disclosures, incomplete records, authenticated materials, omitted communications. Each sentence pushed the hearing further away from procedure and closer to justice. Finally, he paused. Rachel could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the faint shifting of paper, Titan's slow breathing. Then the ruling came. Based upon the information presented today, this court finds that the prior proceedings were materially affected by evidence unavailable for proper review. Accordingly, the conviction is hereby vacated pending further review and immediate corrective action. A collective gasp moved through the courtroom. Reporters stared at one another. Some people in the gallery began crying. Michael covered his face with one hand. Rachel sat perfectly still, unable to move because the words were too large to enter her all at once. Vacated. For years, she had dreamed of that word. Now that it had arrived, it felt almost too fragile to touch. Titan stood slowly and looked up at her. Those amber eyes were the same eyes that had watched her in training fields, in warehouses, in long nights when the rest of the world disappeared. Rachel reached for him with shaking hands. Titan stepped close and pressed his head against her chest. The sound that escaped her was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. It was the sound of a person setting down a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten what her own body felt like without it. She wrapped both arms around the old dog. You remembered, she whispered. Titan leaned harder against her. Across the courtroom, people stood quietly. Even some of the federal agents who had arrived expecting nothing more than procedure looked away with wet eyes. The judge ordered an expanded inquiry into the original investigation. Victor Langston was escorted from the courtroom for questioning. He did not protest loudly. He did not make speeches. His silence said enough. Rachel barely watched him leave. For the first time in years, she was not looking at the people. who had taken something from her. She was looking at the one who had brought something back. 3 months later, winter arrived softly across the Virginia countryside. Frost covered the fields in the early mornings. Thin ribbons of smoke rose from distant chimneys beneath pale blue skies. The world had moved forward. Investigations continued. Reviews unfolded. Reporters chased news stories. Headlines changed. For Rachel Carter, life had become something she once believed she would never experience again. Ordinary. On a quiet piece of land outside Richmond, a small white farmhouse sat among oak trees and rolling hills. The property was modest. Nothing impressive to anyone passing by. Just a porch, a gravel driveway, a patch of field, and enough silence to hear the wind move through bare branches. To Rachel, it felt like mercy. She stood on the front porch wrapped in a warm jacket, holding coffee between both hands while the sunrise spread across the fields. For several minutes, she did nothing but listen. Birds in the trees. A tractor somewhere beyond the hill. Titan breathing beside her. The old German shepherd rested on a thick blanket near her boots. His muzzle had grown wider. His joints were slower, but his eyes remained bright, calm, and content. Rachel reached down and scratched behind his ears. Not a bad view, partner. Titan thumped his tail against the porch boards. The simple sound made her laugh. Her conviction had been vacated, but the story was not over. The investigation into Victor Langston and the original review team continued. Additional records had been found. Several officials had resigned. Others were under inquiry. Rachel knew there would be depositions, testimony, paperwork, and public explanations for a long time. But she no longer woke each morning inside a cell. She no longer had to fight the whole world just to say her own name with dignity. Most importantly, she no longer carried the burden alone. Titan had never abandoned her. Not when accusations came. Not when years passed. Not when people with titles and polished language buried the truth under procedure. Later that afternoon, Rachel drove into town for a small gathering, organized by former colleagues and friends. There were no cameras, no podiums, no official statements. Just coffee, soup, folding chairs, and people brave enough to admit they should have asked more questions sooner. Michael Reeves was there. So was Mark Benson. A few retired agents came quietly, some with apologies they struggled to put into words. When Titan entered, conversations softened. Children approached carefully to pet him. Veterans shook his paw. Former agents thanked him as if he understood every word. Maybe he did. Rachel watched from beside the fireplace as Mark sat down near her. "I still think about that day in court," he said. Rachel smiled. "So do I." Mark looked at Titan sleeping near the fire. "Everyone keeps talking about the drive. The files. The missing record." Rachel followed his gaze. Titan's paw stretched toward the warmth. "The files mattered," she said. Mark waited. Rachel's smile softened. But Titan was not looking for evidence. He was looking for the truth. "There is a difference." Neither spoke for a while. The fire crackled. Outside, evening settled over the small town. That night, back at the farmhouse, snow began falling gently. Rachel sat beside the living room window while Titan rested near the fireplace. The house glowed with warmth. Beyond the glass, the fields disappeared beneath soft white flakes. For a long time, Rachel watched the fire. Then she looked toward Titan. He was sleeping peacefully now. No tension in his body. No waiting at a kennel gate. No unfinished duty weighing on him. She smiled. "We solved one last case together," she whispered. Titan did not open his eyes. He simply released a long, contented sigh and settled closer to the fire. In that quiet farmhouse, beneath the falling snow, two partners finally found what they had been searching for. Not victory. Not headlines. Not revenge. Home. Weeks turned into months, and the truth kept unfolding. Some people wanted the story to be simple. A corrupt official. A hidden drive. A heroic dog. But Rachel knew real life was rarely that clean. Her conviction had not happened because one man lied once. It had happened because too many people trusted paperwork more than conscience. Too many people mistook reputation for character. Too many people decided that if a system sounded official, it must also be right. That lesson stayed with her. On certain mornings, she would sit at the kitchen table with documents spread before her, reviewing the ongoing reports Michael sent over. Titan would lie nearby, chin resting on his paws, watching her the way he always had. Whenever the pages became too much, Rachel would close the folder and step outside. The fields helped. So did the cold air. So did the sound of Titan's paws following her across the porch. One afternoon, Mark Benson visited with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Rachel opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was Titan's old training ball, the one he had kept beside him at the K9 facility all those years. Rachel held it in both hands. For a moment, she could not speak. Mark cleared his throat. He kept it safe? Figured it belonged here now. Rachel looked down at Titan. The old dog lifted his head, recognized the ball, and gently took it from her hand. He carried it to the rug near the fireplace and placed it there with the same care he had once placed Rachel's birthday cards beside it in his kennel. Rachel wiped her eyes and laughed softly. Still organizing evidence, huh? Titan wagged his tail once. Spring came slowly that year. Snow melted along the fence line. Grass returned in patches of green. On warmer days, Rachel sat on the porch while Titan slept in the sun. Sometimes neighbors stopped by. Sometimes former colleagues called. Sometimes strangers sent letters, not because they knew what to say, but because they wanted her to know they had heard the truth. Rachel answered some. Others she simply kept in a box. Healing, she learned, was not the same as forgetting. It was not pretending the years had not hurt. It was choosing not to let the worst chapters become the whole book. One clear evening, Michael came by after another court update. Victor Langston had been formally charged in connection with evidence suppression and obstruction. Additional officials faced disciplinary action. The review into Rachel's case had expanded to other matters touched by the same office. Michael stood with her on the porch as the sky turned orange. "You may never get every answer," he said gently. Rachel nodded. "I know. Does that bother you?" She looked out over the field. Titan slept at her feet, ears twitching at some dream only he understood. "It used to," she said. "Now I think some answers matter more than others. I know I told the truth. I know Titan remembered. I know enough people finally listened. That has to be enough for today." Michael smiled faintly. "For today is not bad." Rachel looked down at Titan. "For today is everything." That summer, the farmhouse filled with the kind of ordinary life Rachel once feared she had lost forever. Groceries in the fridge. Mud on the porch after rain. Coffee cups left in the sink. A dog bed in every room because Titan pretended he needed options. Friends came for dinner. Mark brought treats he claimed were medically approved. Michael brought case updates, and, eventually, fewer apologies. Rachel began speaking quietly to new agents in ethics seminars. She never made herself the hero of the story. She told them about assumptions, about pressure, about how easy it is to believe the person with the title and doubt the person standing alone. She told them that justice is not a machine that runs by itself. It is a responsibility people must choose again and again, especially when choosing it costs something. And sometimes, when the room felt too formal, she told them about Titan walking into court and ignoring her. They always laughed at first. Then they listened, because the story was not really about a dog finding a drive. It was about loyalty refusing to die in a place built out of paperwork and doubt. One evening near the end of summer, Rachel sat on the porch as fireflies blinked over the grass. Titan lay beside her, his head resting against her boot. The sky had turned deep blue. Somewhere down the road, a child laughed. A pickup passed slowly, tires crunching over gravel. Rachel placed one hand on Titan's shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "people keep calling you a hero." Titan blinked at her. "Do not let it go to your head." His tail tapped once. Rachel laughed. The sound surprised her sometimes. How easy it came now. How natural. Not because life had been returned exactly as it was. It never would be. Some years could not be restored. Some friendships would remain broken. Some wounds would ache when the weather changed. But loss was no longer the only thing living in her. There was gratitude. There was peace. There was the quiet miracle of being believed. Above the farmhouse, stars appeared one by one. Titan shifted closer, warm and solid beside her. Rachel leaned back in her chair and watched the night settle over the fields. The world would remember the headlines. The overturned conviction. The hidden drive. The investigation into Victor Langston. The dramatic moment inside the Richmond courthouse when an old German shepherd stared down a powerful man and changed the direction of a case. Rachel would remember something else. She would remember a young K9 with oversized paws stealing her sandwich at Quantico. She would remember long drives and quiet trust. She would remember birthday cards read through kennel bars. She would remember a dog who waited at a gate every afternoon because some part of him knew the story was not finished. Most of all, she would remember that when everyone expected Titan to run to her for comfort, he did something braver. He turned toward the truth. Sometimes justice arrives through evidence, testimony, and law. Sometimes it arrives through people brave enough to admit they were wrong. And sometimes, when the world has buried the truth beneath titles, records, and years of silence, justice walks into a courtroom on four aging paws and refuses to look away.